The fact that I even came back to the Camp Blood films after what was arguably one of the biggest middle fingers I've experienced while doing this channel is, frankly, nothing short of amazing. And I hope it acts as a testament to my dedication to seeing this franchise through to the bitter end, come hell or high water. For those of you who may have missed my last dip into the septic tank, Camp Blood 4 and 5 were presumably shot back to back in 2016, with Camp Blood 4 being essentially a 70 to 80 minute movie of people walking around with bad filters layered over the top of them and very little else, and Camp Blood 5 having the audacity to essentially recycle 60 of that 70 to 80 minutes into a "hey, remember what happened last time?" movie, with an additional 10 minutes or so slotted in throughout the 60 minutes, adding incredibly little, making almost no sense, and actively attempting to discourage the viewer from watching. Both of these films came out at the same time, because of course they did, and both films charged full retail price for the privilege, which is especially nuts when you could essentially just buy Camp Blood 5 and get both movies with extra footage for the price of one. I hated those movies with a passion, and they were likely some of the worst films I sat through last year. So when it came to following it up with Camp Blood 6, the bar for my expectations were on the floor. Basically, I just wanted a story that wasn't 50 minutes of people walking to a place followed up with 20 minutes of murdering people via interpretive ASMR. Mercifully, heading into Camp Blood 666, there were a few promising hints that we may be getting something at least a little bit more substantive. For starters, it's all change yet again, as we have a new director and writer at the helm who hadn't been involved in the Camp Blood films previously. And it looks like, once again, we'd be dealing with another soft reboot of the franchise, making this the 4th Camp Blood reboot in 12 years. And I get the distinct feeling that that won't be changing anytime soon. So, with an all-new cast and crew at the helm, and seemingly a do whatever the fuck you want as long as it's 75 plus minutes long from Sterling, we dive once again into the legend of Camp Blackwood. And we open essentially getting the Sterling prerequisites out of the way up front, as a satanic cult perform a sacrifice on a young woman. The sacrifice triggers the rise of a demonic entity known as Stanley Cunningham, who possesses one of the cult members, butchers the rest of the cult before leaving the sacrifice with a demon clown mask, thus setting up our clown killer for this movie. We're then treated to a Windows Movie Maker slideshow of scenes from the film we haven't seen yet, as 3 minutes of title cards with static text plays over music from the Sterling royalty-free audio library. Before we crash into the boob quota for this movie, as a photographer is doing a nudie shoot with a model out in the woods. The model sees the clown killer and freaks out. The photographer turns around to see where the killer is, but doesn't see anyone. The killer then reappears and butchers the pair of them. And I know I'm saying this with a slight tongue-in-cheek, but I honestly can't see any other reason that this sequence exists other than Sterling told the filmmakers to have at least one nudie scene in the film, so they just crammed it into the beginning to get it out of the way. Hell, I forgot the sequence even happened until I went back through my notes to write this review. The film then starts proper, as this time around our main protagonist is Betsy, a woman with womanly ways of womaning who's breasting boobily. Seriously, the script for this does the lead actress so dirty. Betsy's main characteristics are literally that she's a woman, a daughter, a girlfriend, and as a mouthpiece to get exposition out of the way as cleanly and clearly as possible because the film doesn't have the budget to show over tell. As such, this means that Betsy really spends the majority of the film being given instructions off of people, doing whatever's asked of her, and very, very rarely she gets to do a little bit of sleuthing herself without the men around. It's that kind of a movie. So anyway, Betsy is awoken in the early hours of the morning by her dad, who, for some reason, is calling her before the sun is up to urgently tell her about a problem that, according to points later in the film, he's known about for at least a couple of years. And that's that he's worried about his son, Betsy's brother, because he's been coming home later and later at night recently, and in the last couple of days he hasn't come home at all. Betsy is somewhat concerned for her brother, and her dad tells her that he thinks he's been indoctrinated into a cult. A satanic cult! As they all seem to congregate up at Camp Blackwood. It's that last point that really makes Betsy take in the seriousness of the situation, as she knows Camp Blackwood as Camp Blood, the site of several grisly murders many years ago. Whether this is a reference to the deaths in the original Camp Blood from 1999, as that technically would be coming up to a decade or so since then, or if they're talking about the new backstory added in Camp Blood 2 for the deaths, or if they're creating their own totally new backstory for the franchise at this point, I can't say. To hazard a guess, I'd say they're ignoring everything that's come before this movie because they named the clown killer and I believe they didn't do that in the earlier movies, but I could be misremembering. Anyway, the call ends and Betsy gets up right away to go and visit her boyfriend Tom's place to fill him in and to try and coax him into going up into the woods with her. Tom's chilling watching the director's old home movies, for some reason, but after a quick chat with Betsy, he reluctantly agrees to go with her. Which means we get treated to a Camp Blood staple of extended driving scene, extended unpacking the car scene, extended find the Camp Blood sign scene, and extended woodland wandering scene, until eventually they arrive at an abandoned and burned out concrete structure. It looks like some kind of brick cabin. The pair decide to head in and explore, and inside they find several bones, limbs, and blood-soaked clothing near a makeshift altar. The pair grabs one of the bloodied shirts and prepare to head away, when they accidentally bump into and terrify a park ranger, who accuses them of being troublemakers, pranksters, and when Betsy and Tom show him the bloodied shirt, he dismisses them by telling them that these are the kind of pranks that are pulled in the park every day by glue-sniffing punks, that he's sick of it, and that if they aren't being dickheads, they'll take that shirt to the local sheriff's office and get them to deal with it, because he sure won't be. Betsy and Tom leave, the ranger takes a look into the cabin thingy, and the clown killer emerges and kills him. Betsy and Tom arrive at the sheriff's office to fill them in on what's going on, but surprise, surprise, they are pretty much as dismissive as the forest ranger was, dismissing the bloodied shirt as being covered in animal blood and retelling the pair that drug-addled teens are very likely to blame. He tells the pair to really not think too much into it and that Betsy's brother will likely just turn up of his own volition before sending the pair home. When they're out of earshot, however, the sheriff decides to send one of his own officers up to the woods just on the off chance that something nefarious is going on. Meanwhile, Betsy's decided that she isn't just gonna take go home for an answer and essentially twists Tom's arm into heading back up into the woods to continue looking for clues. Which they do. While they're on their long extended driving sequence back up to the woods, however, the officer that the sheriff sent has already arrived. He too gets an extended walking in the woods sequence until he finds the brick cabin, goes in, sees the blood and limbs, freaks out a bit, and then gets attacked by the clown killer. Our officer slowly runs out of the woods and into a parking lot with the clown killer chasing not too far behind. While hunting the officer, however, a random guy out fishing gets in the way and the clown killer takes him out. Only, because of bad line management, the way the camera is set up makes the sequence look like the clown's machete somehow manipulated reality and popped our dead fisherman directly onto the floor where he stood previously. It's weird. Anyway, Betsy and Tom re-arrive back at the camp and after a bit more walking around, they find an abandoned tent. They head inside to explore and find a few bits and pieces, amongst them a diary that Betsy recognises as her brother's. Betsy has a quick read through it and it pretty much confirms that her brother is in a satanic cult, but doesn't give them any further clues as to where he is right now. Though it does give the pair a name to go and chase up. Cara, which is the name of a girl that Betsy was briefly friends with in high school who was known for weirdness and gave off the kind of energy that would suggest that she was in a satanic cult. So, the pair head over there, and while the extended driving sequence to Cara's house is happening off screen, we get treated to two back-to-back scenes of two girls from the satanic cult heading up to the woods to do more satanic culty shit, I guess, only for the clown killer to kill them one after another in very similar ways. Honestly, it feels like these two scenes were supposed to be separated by another scene in a different location, but it got cut because it's so jarring to see the exact same scenario play out twice in the exact same way, but with two different characters who added nothing to the actual main plot. With random needless stabbing out of the way, however, Betsy and Tom arrive at Cara's place. Cara is suspicious of the pair, especially when they mention the cult, but she ultimately lets them into the house. Only, there isn't really a lot to share. Cara claims that she was kicked out of the cult years ago and has been trying to put those days behind her, another element that makes me think that this was probably a clean restart. And that Betsy's brother was still in the cult when she left, but he was starting to move with the bigger movers and shakers within the cult. The pair thank her for her time, and after they leave, the clown killer turns up, somehow, and kills her. No time for that though, as the pair go back to the sheriff with the diary and Kara's testimonial, and that is finally enough to push the sheriff into action. And in an all-or-nothing move, he decides to take his entire department up to the woods to not only put the clown killer stuff to bed once and for all, but to hopefully find his missing officer. And that leads us really into the final act for this one. As the team all head up into the woods, the clown killer's supernatural powers become much more prominent as a final showdown between the powers of law and order collide with the world of the devil. Will Betsy and Tom find Betsy's brother? Will the sheriff finally teach those glue-sniffing punks to change their wicked ways? And probably the most important point of all, will this film stick the landing? Please, I hope to God it does. All this and more will be answered if you check out Camp Blood 666. And if you're coming to this review wondering if things could possibly get any worse, you may be either disappointed or relieved to find out that no, things actually have gotten quite a bit better. What I do need to stress, however, is that just because Camp Blood 666 is better than the last 3 films, that isn't really much of a ringing endorsement when you consider that the last 3 films included 2 of the worst films I've personally ever seen in my 8 to 9 years of writing about films in a semi-professional capacity, not to mention the 15 or so years I was casually viewing, and a film that is widely considered by fans of Mark Polonia to be the worst film Mark Polonia has ever made. And when you consider that Mark Polonia is a fairly infamous person to the genre and that even his fans won't stan his entry into this, well, I hope that kind of frames the kind of quality we're dealing with here. It very much is a film that does the barest of bare minimums, and had this not been a Camp Blood film, I'd have likely been tearing it a new one. But because it's a Camp Blood film and the bar is so low, it kind of establishes itself as a top 3 contender in the franchise simply because it didn't shit its pants and then threaten to smear that shit all over itself and me. I guess what I'm trying to say is, as a film, it's bad. As a Camp Blood film, it's still not great, but the others are so bad, it pushes this up. To start things off on a positive note, the script is probably this film's strongest element. I was beyond pleased to see that this thing actually had a plot and something approaching an act structure. With the last 3 films, the plot was basically go wander around in the woods for a bit, oh no, you're all being deaded. This film actually tries to constructively build and develop on a story across the runtime. Introducing the satanic cult angle to the killer clown mythology is a new-ish angle for the series that hasn't properly been attempted up to this point, and by framing the film as a missing persons piece, it means the characters get to do a bit more than just wandering aimlessly waiting for their demise. Don't get me wrong, we are effectively here swapping extended walking sequences for what I can at best describe as a couple walk from house A to house B, back to house A, to the woods, back to house A, house C, back to the woods for 80-ish minutes, which is hardly the most thrilling thing in the world, but they are at least bothering to give these characters something to do. They're at least bothering to try to make these characters interact with someone other than the core players in this thing. And rather than setting the entire plot of the film up in the opening 10 minutes, fucking around for 50 minutes and then slopping a dissatisfying they all die round up into the final 10, here they actually pepper the plot throughout with hints as to what's happened to Betsy's brother. They at least try to set up barriers to prevent them from getting a direct answer, and they seem actually invested in not wanting to actively waste the audience's time too badly. With that in mind, however, that isn't to say that this is somehow a brilliant feature. As mentioned, this film is heavily bogged down with instances of characters having to repeatedly backtrack on themselves. They do a lot of scenes where the characters find a piece of information, go to dig into it to see if they can learn anything new, only to find that the source they've contacted knows nothing and it's essentially wasted 5 to 10 minutes of screen time. They have multiple kill scenes throughout the film, which is a good thing considering the droughts we've had in the last few films, but they don't really link into the main plot at hand. They come across as repetitive and generally feel at times like they've been inserted into points in the film where it was starting to get a bit dry, just to try and shake things up a bit. Which again, I'd rather that than just endless walking montages, but that's not really addressing the core issue of why there's a dry patch in the film. It'd be like randomly inserting a cute cat picture into the film just to try and get the audience's attention back on side. And even though there is significantly less walking sequences in this film than the others, they are still here, they are still prominent, and while I am more than happy that they're a bit more broken up, that still doesn't address the issue that they're there in the first place. The act structuring is actually not too bad. We have a solid first act where they set up most of the initial plot, get the characters to where they need to be, and establish that, for the most part, they're going to be on their own if they want to continue looking for Betsy's brother. Unfortunately, things do take a bit of a turn in the second act around the time Betsy and Tom go to the sheriff's office, as, with 20 minutes or so to fill, the film essentially starts really slowing down, creating a lot of false trails that lead to dead ends. It does a lot of random kill sequences that aren't really connected to the main plot, and it seems to really start stretching out conversational sequences to desperately get the film up to runtime. This all leads to a third act with about 10 to 15 minutes to spare that feels very blunt, almost to the extent that it feels like it was drafted by children. With the sheriff taking his entire department up to the woods after being so dismissive feeling a little forced, and the way the characters behave once they get up there comes across as unusual, frankly. Like, that final 10 minutes is probably the most entertaining of the entire film, and it's the act where two of the more entertaining twists occur, which was ultimately what really pulled this movie up quality-wise for me. But yeah, simplistic is probably the best way to describe this film. And not simplistic but effective, just overly simple. At times to its own detriment. The transitions between acts are also a bit blunt. There were clear ways to make these transitions quite smooth, but basically the characters announce they're going to go do something, and that's the signal that the act is going to change. Further still, the way the characters are more generally written here is also kind of bizarre. So, anyone who isn't Betsy or Tom in this movie is just dismissive or shrinking. Basically, they either tell the pair they're worrying over nothing and to stop looking into it because there's really nothing to look into, or they just don't really want to talk about what's going on for reasons they don't really want to disclose. Which could have been done quite effectively with the right degree of tone, atmosphere and direction, but here it's played again very bluntly and simplistically. It's less of a Wicker Man scenario where everyone is in on the cult and doesn't want the pair looking into it because it would get them involved, and more that they genuinely just can't be arsed to actually get involved because it's too much work for something that they just can't be arsed with. Which, while very accurate to modern policing and enforcement, is not particularly great storytelling. Especially when so much of the film's delaying tactics is just cops or rangers telling them that this isn't an issue worth exploring. Betsy and Tom are the only folks who get any different kind of treatment, and the best way I can describe their characters is sponge-like, in the sense that they don't seem to have any characteristics beyond the primary mission of find Betsy's brother, and to react in the most vanilla way possible to anything mentioned to them. You've got to imagine, there's a moment here where the police tell the couple that they aren't going to investigate a literal sacrificial altar in the middle of the woods in the area, and that the pair should ignore it and just go home and live their lives, and Betsy's response is the most half-hearted, "They won't help us, but I've got to find out what happened to my brother. I'm gonna go back up there," that I've ever seen delivered on screen. I want to know more about the core cast. I want to know what drives them, what they do for jobs, what their passions are, what they hate. Do they have any past history that would make me actually give a damn about what they're doing now? But no, Betsy and Tom exist in the moment, and when the credits roll, they're gone forever. All the depth of a Pringle and none of the flavour to boot, which is a real shame. The script was co-written and directed by first-timer to the franchise, Ted Mehring. Ted has 5 writing and directing credits, 4 of which were films that he wrote and directed, and 1 credit apiece for solo directing or solo writing. This film sits in the middle of his filmography at this time, and looking at his other credits, he seems to have a bit of a passion for recreating the tone and vibe of older horror and science fiction films. With credits such as Revenge of the Devil Bat looking and feeling like the old B-movie horrors of the 40s and 50s, and other titles including Bloodbath in the House of Knives and Invasion of the Reptoids having a more 70s grindhousey edge to them. He seems like a fun director. His last credit was in 2020, and based on what I've seen here, while I wasn't completely won over, I would be interested in seeing what he could do on his own home turf. Also on co-writing duties we have Monty Hunter. He's really more of an actor than a writer, with 22 acting credits and only 3 writing credits, but he seems to have a rather varied career within the horror genre. with titles such as Nazi Dawn, a film about ghost Nazis, and Frankenstein Rising, I hope that one speaks for itself, under his belt. Camp Blood 666 was his last and latest title, but he was last seen on the acting front in 2023 in the short film My Husband is the Devil. On the direction front, it's a pretty similar story to the scripting, honestly. Tom, as with all the other directors to pick this franchise up, was seemingly working with a skeleton crew of first-timers to the industry, or folks who had only worked on sterling films. And that's assuming he wasn't just flying solo with the cast from time to time as well. What I will say is I greatly admire that Tom actually tried to do something with the film beyond just stretching a 15-minute short film pitch to 76 minutes. And it's clear he does have a vision that he wants to realise on screen. However, it is kind of unavoidable to say that if your budget is only $30 and a slap on the back, and the only people who can help you get this off the ground are amateurs or folks who haven't had the experience required to realise the vision, it's not going to live up to its potential. Which sadly is rather the case here. Shots are frequently misframed and are corrected on screen, as in the actor will go to sit down and in a normal film the camera would gently follow him down to their seat, if required, but here the cast will go to take a seat, land half in and half out of the shot, and the camera will shudder, judder and bounce to desperately try and get them back in shot. And that happens multiple times here. I don't know how much time they had to do retakes, but a lot of this film feels like they had one, maybe two goes at a take before moving on. At first, I was really kind of impressed with the kill scenes. They seem to have actually bothered to mix up some real fake blood, rather than the last few films offering little more than a trickle and CGIing in the rest. And they really did try their best to mask impact shots. They make stabbings look convincing and make the blood splatter effectively. I'd say the first 2 to 5 deaths in this film do work quite well and should be called out as arguably some of the best kills in the series thus far. However, after that initial buzz, it does seem like the inspiration ran out a bit. The kills become a bit repetitive, they start showing less blood, and eventually the blood more or less stops altogether, with a few scenes resorting to paranormal lightning attacks to see off cast members to try and save budget or time seemingly, which was a bit of a shame. Beyond that though, I can feel a genuine attempt to deliver something solid here, and while I personally don't feel like it completely succeeds in realising the vision it started with, I can absolutely appreciate the effort of a filmmaker trying. In that regard, I can only compliment them on their attempt. Direction of the cast, again, is a similar story. I can see how, on paper, the dialogue could have been read with a real tone and vibe to help create an element of rural horror to proceedings. Unfortunately, the cast here were mainly either first-time actors with limited experience, or bit part players who here were getting a bit of a promotion to a more meaty part. As such, a mixture of cast inexperience and the fact that I don't feel like Tom's strength is in his cast direction, combined with the fact that most of the sets seem to be just someone's house or one or two approved on-location pieces, it really doesn't help matters. As the end result is a stiff set of performances with cast members who don't really know where to stand within the frame, don't deliver their lines with any degree of confidence, don't interact with the set unless instructed to specifically, and just don't really feel like they know what they're doing here. With the dialogue being a bit hit and miss across the runtime, it means that the scenes that had genuinely well-written lines get massively undersold by a cast who don't know how to deliver them properly and seemingly aren't being given any more instruction than just say the line but be sad. And the lines that were badly written end up being delivered in such a way that runs the gauntlet between accidentally hilarious and genuinely cringy. It is, however, on the Cine and editing front that we really find the worst of the film. What we have here is a film mainly shot for function over form, with the majority of the shots simply being locked off tripod pieces with no dynamics or depth to the shot, poor composition that doesn't take into consideration depth or the rule of thirds or even really the line. The shots that don't have the pleasure of a tripod are shaky, blurry and oftentimes messily handled, with several shots cutting into the action right as the camera operator is still actually setting up the shot. There's a real drought on B-roll here, with only a very small number of cutaways on hand, including an extreme close-up of the killer clown's eye, which seems to get recycled 3 to 4 times across the runtime. Worse still is the visual effects and post-production processings, which are mercifully minimal but really don't help things. The most obvious recurring issue is the lightning effects, which, I don't even think they are CG. I think whoever handled post just generated 2 slightly different lightning frames in Photoshop and then turned it into a transparent GIF before dropping it into the movie. It's painful whenever it turns up, and they stretch and bow the image, distorting it terribly. It looks horrendous and totally killed anything they were really going for with this one. Even small things aren't quite right, like the opening titles just being seemingly random chosen fonts statically placed over images of the film, which also spoils chunks of the movie in the process. Small things like that really just take the film down quite considerably for me. The one thing on an effects standpoint that I will give the film is that the colour grade wasn't offensive. The last few films have either gone hog wild on plug-in visual effects, or they've graded in a very desaturated, ugly way. This film's grade is pretty okay. It embraces colour, they don't oversaturate too hard. It's a pretty decent attempt. On the edit front itself, however, it's a bit of a mess. As mentioned, due to the lack of B-roll and seemingly the lack of time to do multiple takes, it very much feels like a film being reconstructed from what it can, rather than being actually curated and cut with care. Shots cut way too early or too late at multiple points, it looks like outtakes have been used in the absence of actual good takes to help smooth things over. There's no pacing or rhythm to the cuts, leading to several moments where things drag, sag, or become seizure-inducing for no real reason related to the narrative. I also spotted at least a couple of occasions where, to really try and squeeze just a few seconds more onto the runtime, they'll slow entire scenes down by 3 to 4%. Not enough that it's distracting, but enough that if you look at people's mouth movements or stuff in the background of location scenes, you'll see they're moving unusually slowly, almost dreamlike. It's a cheap and dirty tactic, but I'm kind of amazed to see it in action here. Performance-wise, as mentioned, the vast majority of the cast were first-timers or bit-parters who got a promotion. And as mentioned, that reflects in how they work here. I can honestly say that I don't think there's a single good performance in this film, just various shades of bad, with probably the best performance in the whole thing being Tina Krause, who also by chance is probably the actress with the most experience in this film, with 134 credits. She plays the nude model in the opening of the film, who at least seems to understand the assignment and relishes the chance to do some pretty decent sarcastic, over-the-top acting while freezing her arse off. It's not a great performance, but she knows exactly what she's signed up for here. And, given she's done a fair bit of work over the years with the likes of J.R. Bookwalter, Sterling and other low no-budget indie studios, if anyone was going to understand the assignment, I figure it would be her. She gives exactly the quality expected. Shoshana Green and Quinton J. Alexander play Betsy and Tom. Shoshana at this point has appeared in bit parts on low no-budget productions and just doesn't give enough here for lead material. She struggles to get her lines out, doesn't bring any kind of physicality to the role, and I feel like she was asleep at the wheel for the most part. Quinton, by contrast, was, and I still believe is, a first-timer. This was the only thing he'd starred in, and he mumbles his way through the film again with zero energy or enthusiasm. He isn't a particularly good physical actor and his deliveries didn't really do anything for me. As for the rest of the cast, they range from genuinely terrible performances that made me question if they ever had actually acted before, to eccentric performances that made me question if they should ever act again. I really struggled to muster any kind of enthusiasm for this cast, honestly. And when I can say, somewhat confidently, that the cast of Dustin Ferguson's attempts at least seem to be a bit more alive behind the eyes than this cast, that is a cause for concern. And finally, the soundtrack. It's horrible. It's a 75-25 split of royalty-free tracks from Sterling's royalty-free sound catalogue and old tracks from other Camp Blood movies. They're thrown down pretty much with no attention to detail, they start when they want, they end abruptly when they want, and on more than a few occasions, multiple music tracks will just be slopped on top of each other, making just a blanket wall of noise. Making matters even worse, they mix this music way too loud into the overall mix, meaning most of the dialogue track can get pretty inaudible at times. And rather interestingly, they seemingly didn't have access to a mic outside of the shooting period, because in instances where the cast mumbled their lines or where the mic didn't quite cleanly pick them up, rather than doing an ADR session to cover the gaps, they instead just crank the ass out of the on-set audio on specific words within the line delivery so you can hear it over the music. Meaning every so often you'll get jump scared by just random words within a conversation because the actor mumbled it. It's kinda wild. Camp Blood 666 was released in May 2017 by Sterling Entertainment and Alpha Video. It's a bare-bones release with no extras, just the movie dumped on disc. In 2020, it got a Blu-ray upgrade through Sterling's in-house label and was predominantly distributed via Makeflix. Though, this isn't much of an improvement on the DVD, just an upscale of the old DVD file with some artifacting and interpolation issues and no extras. In 2021, it would get its latest release as part of the Camp Blood collection, which brought the 11 films all together into 2 discs. It's compressed even more than the solo release, and the lack of extras continue, leading to a somewhat underwhelming package. Camp Blood 666 is almost certainly a step in the right direction, in the same sense that getting a concussion is a step in the right direction from having your legs cut off. While I absolutely appreciate that this actually had filmmakers behind it that actually wanted to make this movie, and I can say I enjoyed this one a lot more than most of the other Camp Blood films, it's starved of budget and resource to the point that it physically just can't get itself off the ground and into good shape. And that's a real shame. I'm now 7 films into this franchise and I'm still kind of amazed that this is probably the best stab the series has had at just making a somewhat solid killer clown movie. This shouldn't be that difficult to achieve. I know that they make a direct sequel to this film many years on from this one, and I think the next entry is connected to this one as well, but at this point, I have no idea where this franchise is going next. But I hope to God that it learns from this film and starts actively trying to build on the rough around the edges but sincere framework that this film's put in place. May God have mercy on us all.